Hi everyone, welcome to Rescuing Watches. Today we have a bit of an obscure Omega reference to restore. This is an Omega Seamaster Compressor from 1969, and the name comes from this very unique square case called a key bolt compressor case. This here is the first square Seamaster model ever made, and one of the first water-resistant square watches. We'll dive into this later, but first let's have a look because the watch is in very poor condition. It wants to run, but it keeps on stopping after a few seconds. And for some reason, this is the second watch we find with the straps cut. It's all coated in this greenish dust, which is already all over the bench. This is called verdigris, and it seems that it's coming from... oh, wow. It's coming out of the spring bars. I've never seen so much buildup. This must have taken years. Verdigris comes from a reaction between the metal of the spring bars that often in vintage watches is not stainless steel, and the oils and moisture from the leather, especially when watches are stored in humid environments during a long time. It can be cleaned with a bit of patience, but it's a good indicator that this watch has not been touched for years. Now, because of the case design, this watch has a split stem, which is made of two sections connected in the middle. To remove it, we just have to pull it out. There you go. This is the female part of the stem, and it goes pressure fitted over the rest of the stem inside the movement. And the watch seems to have completely stopped now. To take this case apart, I had to do some research, and it turns out that we need a special tool. This is the 9001 tool made by Omega to open this specific reference, and it looks like it's a right fit. Not very practical, to be honest, but I was lucky enough to buy the last one on eBay. This is not uncommon. There are a few vintage Omegas that need tools from the manufacturer to be opened, so something else to keep in mind if you're looking for vintage watches to repair. We have to put the spring bars back, otherwise the tool doesn't work, at least according to a drawing in an old Japanese magazine I found in Omega forums. So the watch is supposed to go over the tool like this, and theoretically we press down. Let's see. And nothing is happening. Let me try it again. This is harder than I thought it would be, but I'm pretty sure I'm doing it right. So let me just put more weight on it. Oh! Oh god. I thought I cracked the crystal for a second, but take a look at that. Seems that we have opened it. Let me... No, not open yet. At least partially open, but I'll give it one more go because one of the sides is still stuck. Okay, now. I think I have an idea why these cases are not around anymore. Oh, God. The front case is an absolute mess, and the case back as well. There are good news and bad news. Okay, the bad news are that the inside of the case looks as terrible as the outside, but the good news are that the watch seems to be working again, so at least that's something. Oh, look at all this gunk. It's not the first time I see this happening in a vintage watch. What you're looking at is a melted nitrile rubber gasket. These older gaskets usually remain stable between 5 to 10 years, but if they are not replaced by then, they can degrade and they turn into this paste. Now, you might be wondering, why would someone complicate their lives like this and not make a regular snap-on or screw-on case back? Well, the problem comes when you want to make a square, water-resistant watch. Snap-on casebacks are usually not water-resistant, and a square screw-on back would be difficult to align with the case when you close it. So, to solve these issues, Omega implemented this design, which was developed and patented by Erwin Piquerez, a Swiss case supplier. And he designed the compressor case and made it in a way that when the pressure increases, the caseback moves slightly inwards and squeezes the rubber gasket against the crystal, making it even more water resistant. So basically, the deeper you dive, the more water resistant the watch is. Unfortunately, our gasket melted and now the dial is stuck to the case, so we have to try to detach it without bending it or scratching anything. These cases were also used by other brands like Zenith in their respirator model and Tag Heuer. Back then it was only called Heuer, but they used that in their famous square model, which is the Monaco. Oh boy, it's not looking good. If we have a look underneath the dial, all this... Wait a minute. Look what we have stuck in here. This is part of the setting lever spring. It's supposed to be under the calendar mechanism, so I'm not sure how it got there. But let's store the dial for now, and later we can try to find a way to clean it. The first thing I want to do is to take the movement out of the case. The movement doesn't look stained, which is good, and with a bit of luck it should come out fairly easily. Okay, no luck today, it doesn't move, and it seems quite stuck. It could be that the black rubber went in between the case and the movement, and it's somehow gluing it in place. Since I don't want to force anything and risk breaking a jewel or a pivot, let's take apart the calendar first and see if we can find something underneath. And here you have it. This is the calendar mechanism. You can see it has a bunch of smaller parts attached. Those are the ones that connect it with the motion works, so the set of parts that are moving the hands. We have these 3 clamps that are holding the calendar wheel. And what I didn't mention before is that this is a women's version, so the movement is about the size of my thumbnail. Whoop! And we just had the first screw flying away. But lucky me, I found it in the middle of the bench. This is not even the smallest screw in the movement, and look at this. If this falls from the bench, I will never find it again. I live in a building from the early 1900s, which is quite common here in Switzerland. And the problem is that they have these nice old wooden floors, but with tons of gaps in between the boards. And I'm just waiting for the day that one of these small parts falls in there and I never see it again. Some people use a big magnet so that the parts get stuck to it. So you're on your knees just trying to find the piece for hours. Maybe I should consider buying one. We just finished with the calendar mechanism, so let's have a look. It seems more or less clean compared to the case, which is good, but I still don't have a clue how to take it out. So let's continue disassembling. This part I'm unscrewing is the one that broke, and we found attached underneath the dial, so the setting lever spring, which is part of the keyless works. Okay. The yoke comes next. And then that spring is the yoke spring. Okay, good. That's another one that can fly pretty far. Now, this golden wheel is the minute wheel, and the last part we can remove for now is the setting wheel. Let's go under the microscope, because if we have a look at the interface here, you can see how the movement goes underneath the case, which is why we couldn't take it out. If we look closely, you can see the gap here of what seems to be a movement ring. It's currently fused to the case because the melted rubber went inside the gap. So let's first remove the one on the surface to see if, I don't know, maybe there is some space left where we can put the screwdriver in and pop it out of place. We have to use tools that don't scratch the metal, so usually a pegwood stick works well. Well, that looks much better, but I don't see anything for us to remove that movement ring, and because it's still stuck in place, we have to try to dissolve the rubber. That's most likely also underneath. So I will leave the whole thing soaking in isopropanol overnight and hope that the plan B works. It's been now 15 hours soaking, so let's have a look. We can still see the black rubber residue on the case, so it didn't dissolve, but let's hope it at least softened up a bit. The isopropanol will evaporate quickly, but we still have to blow the excess. I went to sleep thinking, how can we open this case? And my plan is to use one of these suction heads that goes attached to the case back opener. You would usually use this to open stubborn screw-on case backs when other tools don't work, but since this is basically the same, we just want to rotate the movement holder to detach it from the rubber underneath. I think it might work. It's surprisingly tight, but it's turning. Okay, a bit more. It seems to be spinning freely now, so that should be good enough. Now we should be able to take the movement out of the case. There you go. The movement ring is finally off. And take a look underneath. This is what we thought it was happening. You can see here all the rubber stuck in between. It does feel softer now after soaking the movement, but we still need to use, I guess, acetone or something a bit stronger to remove that completely from the case. Let's see if we can finally take this out. I can't believe it. We cannot, but I think I know what might be the issue here. I saw before that the stem still goes a bit inside the pendant tube, and that could be blocking the movement inside the case. So theoretically, if we lift it from the bottom part, we should be able to slide it out. Yes. Okay. Well, wait. I don't want to get excited. Okay, now. So after more than 24 hours, we managed to take the movement out. This is a new record for me. Oh, wow. Beautiful movement finish by Omega, especially on the oscillating weight. Great. I'm just glad it's not all covered in melted rubber at this point, although most of the case is, and it will not be fun to clean, I can tell you that much. We can see the Omega logo engraved inside, the reference 566014, the famous Seamaster logo on the back, and it's also written 1-69, which I'm guessing it means that this watch was made in January 1969 and most likely not serviced in more than 50 years until we found it. This is an Omega caliber 681, as you can see written here. It's an automatic movement, and what we are taking apart now is called the rotor or the oscillating weight, which is a very important part of the automatic mechanism. The rotor spins around a central axis, and because that central axis is connected to the gears that end up coiling the mainspring, it winds the watch. This one in particular rotates 360 degrees and is able to wind up the watch regardless of the direction in which it spins. There is an interesting story around this. The rotor in wristwatches was developed by John Harwood, a British watchmaker in the 1920s. But Harwood's rotor was only able to rotate around 270 degrees until it hit a spring and was pushed in the other direction. These are what's called a bumper or a hammer automatic movement, and Omega introduced the first mass-produced one in 1943. The rotor we have here in our watch is able to turn 360 degrees, and it's much more energy efficient than a bumper mechanism thanks to the set of parts that we are disassembling now. These are the wheels that allow the rotor to turn completely and to wind the watch in both directions. This mechanism was invented by Rolex in 1931, and they called it perpetual rotor, but because of Rolex patent around it, all the other brands got stuck with the bumper mechanisms for the next 20 years. So it took until 1955 for Omega to implement a bidirectional rotor that could turn completely. Underneath this tiny bridge, there are two connecting pinions, 1 and 2. So when the oscillating rotor spins, these pinions spin as well, and each one of those is connected to one side of that reversing wheel, which is basically two wheels sandwiched on top of each other with some smaller parts in the middle. Because of how the reversing wheel is designed, the core is always able to turn in the same direction, even though the rotor spins back and forth. We can see that the balance wheel spins freely, which is good news. This is the most delicate part of the movement because of that hairspring that connects it to the balance cog, so I have to be very careful here. This is one of the most difficult movements I've worked on up to this point, both because it's quite complex and also very small. I'm not a professional watchmaker, I do this as a hobby. I learned around 3 years ago doing the courses from Mark Lovick, and I'm still learning with every watch I open, so I'm going slowly here, making sure I take a good look to each part and I don't miss anything. If you're interested in getting into the hobby, I would definitely recommend you to have a look at Mark's courses. When I started, I remember thinking, hey, this might be also a good way to afford watches that otherwise I would not be able to buy brand new, but I have to tell you, with all the tools that are needed, it would have been much cheaper to just buy the watches, so take that into account. I'm not sure what this is for. There's a very tiny pinion under this bridge engaging with this spring. Then we have an intermediate wheel, which is this one, and the crown wheel. What you usually see is only the crown wheel connecting directly with this big wheel here. This is the ratchet wheel. But here, for some reason, we have two more wheels and a spring in between. The click goes out, and this is the click spring. Okay. Now, this tiny arm here is a friction spring, and you see those in the first versions of wristwatches with a center seconds hand. What this spring does is to put a slight pressure onto the sweep seconds pinion, which is this long pinion here. That pinion goes all the way down through the dial on the other side of the movement, and it's where the seconds hand goes attached to. Okay, and here we are disassembling the barrel bridge. A bit stubborn, and we can see the barrel and the second wheel coming along. Since it hasn't been serviced in so long, the oils that were once placed on the pivots have now dried up and hardened, which means that instead of lubricating, they do the opposite and get the wheels stuck to their jewels. Let's go under the microscope to remove that small spring underneath, because part of it is going through the plate. Okay. Oop. Let's go slowly. Perfect. Now with the setting lever screw loose, which is this one, we can take out the stem, or the male part of the stem in this case, which goes through the sliding clutch and winding pinion. Both parts fell. Here's the sliding clutch and the winding pinion here. Okay, good. Everything seems to be in one piece for now, except for the setting lever spring. That's the one we need to replace. And on this side, we still have the pallet fork bridge. And underneath, you can see the pallet fork. Perfect. On the other side, we have the setting lever in here, so that's this tiny piece, and the setting lever screw that just fell on the mat. This one is easy to tell apart because it has a small rim, so you don't overscrew it. Time to disassemble this. This is the tiniest barrel ever, and inside it we find a relatively clean barrel arbor. Okay, let's leave it here for now. And the mainspring, which is where the power comes from in mechanical watches. And because it's wound very, very tight inside the barrel, we have to slowly alternate fingers to take it out so it doesn't fly away and we bend it. It actually looks really good, so we won't need to replace it. And even if it's small, this mainspring gives a 40-hour power reserve, so it can store a lot of energy. We have to get everything ready for the watch cleaning machine. This is a crucial part of the process. I have a bunch of smaller mesh baskets so I can organize the parts that go together and I don't have to scratch my head looking for the correct screw later on. Good. And then we have these bigger baskets that go on top of each other. The lower one is for the mainspring, and we can fit also some of the smaller baskets in between. And that should do it. Now the two upper floors have kind of inbuilt compartments where we can fit the plates, the bridges, and the rest of the bigger parts. I wish this was the only cleaning step, but unfortunately we will have to do most of it manually. The watch cleaning machine will not dissolve the melted rubber or the verdigris, so we need a bit of friction for that. We have here the same isopropanol glass jar that we used before, and what we're going to do is to dip a Q-tip and rub it against the case. Okay, that seems to be working pretty well, and as you probably noticed, this keyboard compressor caseback looks very different compared to the regular ones. Do you see these two bolts on the sides? There are two identical ones on the other side of the case, and they can be pushed in because they're connected to a spring on the inside. So the idea is that when the upper case is pressed downwards on top of it, these bolts move inwards and then lock themselves on some slots that are carved on the inside of the upper case. It's a bit of an unusual locking mechanism, but it's able to achieve water resistance up to 30 meters or 100 feet. So quite impressive. Okay, the caseback is done. Let's take off the spring bars again. And I guess we can leave them soaking as well. Maybe the dirt softens up a bit. The dirt and rubber are coming off very nicely. Isopropanol is a solvent you can also use for cleaning dry oils, and many people use it to clean the entire movement as well, if they don't use a cleaning machine. But you always need to go over it by hand with a brush or a Q-tip or something. This is already looking pretty good. Now the last step is the crystal. You can see the Omega logo in the middle. That's pretty cool. As far as I know, no other brand does this. The crystal itself is quite dirty, but at least it's not cracked, which is a relief because it's a rare watch and a rare crystal shape, so there is no chance I would be able to find a replacement one. Here we only have a bit of rubber on the rim. That's gonna take a bit of work, but the rest should be easy to clean. Perfect. The movement is inside the cleaning machine, and it will go through one cycle of cleaning, 2 cycles of rinsing, and then a last drying cycle. So the remaining dirt and debris will get dissolved. And by the way, if you don't want to wait in between YouTube videos for more watch content, make sure you check the Rescuing Watches Instagram or TikTok and give it a follow if you like. Now we took off the rubber manually, but it's time to make those spring bars and the case nice and shiny, so they go 15 minutes into the ultrasonic bath. Out of the watch cleaning machine, everything is looking great and ready to be put together. And my favorite part, have a look at the case. Night and day. If you check out the inside, you will see some rectangular slots. Those are the spaces where the bolts on the case back lock. You can see those here pointing out. Very happy how this cleaned up, but now we have the next challenge, which is a crystal. It's also looking clean and much better than before, but you can see how many scratches we have, and some of them are quite deep, too deep to get removed with polywash. So what we're going to do first is using sandpaper with 2 different grit sizes. We have 1200 and 2000. We start off with the thicker one, which is the 1200, And we want to press the crystal against the sandpaper and go back and forth slowly. Since the glass is curved, we try to tilt it a bit so we remove those deep scratches everywhere, and what's important is to apply always the same pressure. Okay, that looks a bit rough, but it's fine, it's supposed to look like that. Now we can change to the 2000 grit and repeat the same process. Same thing, maintaining constant pressure and making sure we are sanding the whole surface of the crystal. That looks already better, still cloudy, but now we can see that it looks uniform, which is what we're looking for. Perfect. Now, for the last step, we need to use a finer grain size, and that would be polywatch, which has very small abrasive particles and will help us remove the cloudiness and hopefully make it look brand new. To make things faster, we will use the Dremel. I always thought this was a no-go because it can generate heat very quickly and melt through the acrylic, but Alex over at the Watch Repair Tutorials YouTube channel showed very nice results and shared some tips on how to do this. The key is to choose a low to medium speed, and with a cotton buff wheel just go over it for a few minutes without putting pressure on it. Just slowly back and forth. He did it for 3 minutes, and I'm gonna do 2 just in case, because if we screw up this crystal, we're gonna be in trouble. And I think this should be enough. Check this out, the crystal is looking great and ready to be assembled. The Dremel worked quite well, and it saved us a lot of time and sore fingers. This is as far as I will go with the polishing. You know I'm against refinishing cases unless it's an emergency. I have some watches that were over polished by previous owners and I can't help it, but that's the first thing I notice when I put them on. So always better to keep the original condition when possible. This is called braking grease, and it goes in the inner walls of the barrel in automatic movements, and this one here is a thinner grease to coat the mainspring with. Because automatic movements are continuously winding when you wear them, to prevent overwinding and risk snapping the mainspring, the barrel wall is completely smooth, so the end of the spring keeps on sliding and sliding against the edge, and that's why the braking grease is needed. In that way, the mainspring doesn't slide too fast and it doesn't scratch against the inside of the barrel wall. Now that it's greased, we choose the correct arbor size to place the mainspring inside the barrel. In this kit we have 18 different sizes, and what's very surprising is that I still have 7 sizes smaller than this one. I think Giselle Coulter still has the record for the smallest movement ever made with her caliber 101, which is basically the size of a matchstick, so something crazy. I can't imagine fitting the mainspring on that one. We slowly coil it inside the winder. Okay, perfect. This is by far the best and easiest way to do it. And here you can see it all coiled in. And now we press on the back of the winder and it shoots the mainspring directly into the barrel. Here we have the arbor, and I have to make sure I don't place it upside down because most of the times it will fit both ways. And if I don't pay attention, what happens is that the hook of the arbor won't grab the mainspring and it's just not going to work. It's a very time-consuming mistake. The lid goes on and we just press it in. Now I didn't hear it clicking in place. It might be that it was not correctly aligned, but we can also close this with the thicker part of the tweezers, making sure we go over the edge. Okay, now it looks closed. The barrel and the second wheel go back in place. And now, before refitting the barrel bridge, let's put back this spring for the pinion next to the crown wheel. I still don't really understand why these extra wheels are needed. The only thing I can come up with is that because this seems to be a smaller version of the Omega caliber 565, when shrinking down the movement, they had to rearrange the keyless work somehow, and suddenly the crown wheel and the ratchet wheel, which are supposed to engage, were too far apart. So maybe the only way to make these two work together was to add a few more parts in between. With the barrel bridge in place, we can add a bit of oil in the barrel arbor and also in the core of the crown wheel. The sweep second pinion goes in, we don't need to oil this one, and now we place the friction spring on top. If you have a look what I was mentioning earlier, there is barely any space left in between the spring and where the crown wheel goes, so that wheel can't be any bigger, and it's definitely not close enough to engage with the ratchet wheel. Making things thinner and smaller has been the challenge in watchmaking for centuries. But the question here is, why do we have a sweep second pinion and a friction spring to start with? And it's because this is an indirect central seconds mechanism. So in the early days, watches only had an hour and a minute hand because of the technical difficulties of measuring seconds. Once watches got precise enough to add a seconds hand, the easiest way to implement that was to have a sub-seconds dial. Since the fourth wheel was made to fully rotate once every 60 seconds, if you extend that pivot across the movement and across the dial, you can fit the seconds hand on the other side. However, sub-seconds dials can be hard to read, especially in small watches like this one, so watchmakers came up with a way to place the seconds hand in the middle of the movement through an indirect center seconds mechanism like the one we have here. In this mechanism, the train of wheels is in the same position as in watches with a sub-seconds dial, but instead of a longer pinion on the fourth wheel, they implemented that long seconds pinion you saw that goes inside the hollow center wheel pinion. The problem with this is that because that seconds pinion is outside of the power flow, it tends to make the seconds hand flutter, so to prevent that, it needs a tension spring holding it down. This mechanism also has a few issues, so in the late 40s, Zenith released the caliber 133 with a direct center seconds mechanism. They rearranged the train of wheels to have that fourth wheel with a long pinion at the center of the movement, and then the seconds hand was attached to it on the other side. This also allowed for a bigger barrel and a bigger balance wheel, so it improved a lot the precision and power reserve on wristwatches. I know it sounds a bit confusing, so I will link an article in the video description explaining this in case you're interested. Now that our train of wheels is back in place, the bridge goes on top. And to make sure it's in place, I will have to go under the microscope. If the pivot is centered, we will see it through the hole in the middle of the jewel. Okay, and the idea is to move the bridge just a tiny bit sideways, but without putting any downwards pressure onto it until it clicks in place. Okay, and that's what we want to see in all our jewels, that metal shiny bit is the pivot going through. Now, this is tight. Let's go ahead with the dial side of the movement, starting by oiling the winding pinion and the sliding clutch. And if you have a look in the middle, you will see that it has a square hole. As everything inside a watch, it has a very specific purpose. So the stem, which goes through those two parts, also has a square section, which is the one I'm oiling right now. So every time we are turning the crown to set the time or to wind the watch, that movement is passed on to the sliding clutch, which also turns. And good. Now a bit of oil in the middle of the sliding clutch, and we start with the keyless work. So all these parts that we're placing now, the yoke spring, the setting lever, are there to help set the sliding clutch in two different positions. I have to be careful here, the yoke spring goes under quite a bit of tension. Okay, good. Let me show you how this works. The yoke fits in the middle of the sliding clutch, and when it's pushed forwards, it engages with the setting wheel, which is what ends up moving the watch hands to set the time. When it's in the resting position, the teeth of the clutch engage with the winding pinion, which connects on the other side of the movement with the crown wheel to wind the watch. The cannon pinion goes back in. That's pressure fitted. And I'm always making the same mistake. The setting wheel has a chamfered side that should go downwards to engage better with the sliding clutch. The part that pushes the yoke back and forth is the setting lever, which is fixed from the other side of the movement with the setting lever screw. Good. This is the minute wheel. And since the original one was broken, here is the new setting lever spring that I got from eBay. There you go. The setting lever pushes the yoke back and forth, as we said, but it's the setting lever spring that keeps it fixed in position. We don't want to screw it down all the way yet, because that end of the spring needs to be in place first. Otherwise, we can break it. Now it's engaging with the setting lever and we can finish screwing it. Back on the other side to finish with the escapement. We have the pallet fork and the pallet fork bridge, and we'll go back under the microscope. Okay, the pallet fork is in place. The bridge goes on top to secure it, and that pallet fork upper pivot, as you already know, has to go through its jewel. There you go. I was gonna wind the watch a bit to test the pallet fork, but have a look at the ratchet wheel. It seems to me that it's a bit tilted, so let's make sure I screw it down properly. It might be that I didn't place it correctly the first time, because now I see it sitting flush onto the barrel bridge. And yeah, have a look. You can compare here to before and after. It was indeed placed incorrectly. And now the pallet fork seems to be jumping back and forth without issues. These are the little things that will cause me a sleepless night. Why is the watch not working? And eventually have to disassemble the whole movement a second time to inspect it part by part. Luckily, we found the issue before that. We used some B-dip on the balance to make sure that hairspring is clean. And now we can put it back in place. Carefully. Okay, let me give it a bit of help. Perfect! Everything seems to be running smoothly. The amplitude looks good, but we can make it even better by cleaning the cap jewels. What you're looking at here is the shock protection system called Incablock, and it's basically two jewels held on by a spring, which is the one we are opening now with the smallest screwdriver tip. We run the jewels through the B-dip, and now we put a drop of oil on the capstone to then fit it back inside the staff jewel, and we fit both back in position. You can see the drop of oil in the middle, and we also do this for the lower jewels. Time to check how the watch is running, and this is looking great. 3 seconds a day, decent amplitude, and 0.2 milliseconds of bit error. Even 0 seconds a day, -1, so excellent. Quite happy with the performance. Now let's get back to work, this time with the calendar mechanism. The calendar wheel is fixed to the back of the plate with the 3 clamps we removed at the beginning, and I'm working on top of the cushion here because there is paint on the other side of the calendar wheel, and I'm afraid to scratch it off if I work on top of the stacking tool. But I have to say, it's very soft, so screwing these tiny clamps is a bit challenging. This one here is called the date indicator driving wheel. It has an inner ring with a spike and it's driven by the hour wheel. So it turns fully once every 24 hours, which makes that spike engage with the inner teeth of the calendar wheel and flip it to change the date. Next in line we have the date jumper, and this one ensures that the calendar clicks and it stays fixed in place. It does that with the help of the date jumper spring, and that spring is always under tension, so it's common to see vintage watches with the date not really centered in the middle of the dial window. If you see that, it means that the jumper spring is worn down and needs replacement. The hour wheel goes in. Good. And now we can reassemble the calendar mechanism. This one does not include a quick set function, which is what allows you to change only the date without having to advance the hands. Something that you will hear often is that most watch collectors prefer watches without a date complication. And at the beginning I was a bit confused. I thought, okay, more complications the better. But part of it is because you lose a bit of dial symmetry when you have a date window. And the other more practical consideration is that if you like to rotate in between watches, setting the date every time is a bit inconvenient. There's no quick set function, but it does have an automatic winding mechanism. So we start with the reversing wheel and then the two pinions next to each other. As we said before, each one of them is engaging with a different level of that reversing wheel. That's why the smaller one is also taller. To fix this in place, we have a little bridge with some jewels in it, so we will have to oil those as well once we finish. Now we slide the driving wheel, there you go, which is the one that engages with the ratchet wheel to wind the mainspring underneath. And this here is the last bridge that secures those two in place. Okay, both pivots are in. Now screw it down with the help of the plastic tool, and that's it. We have to be gentle here since we have wheels overlapping. If we put too much pressure on the automatic mechanism, we can bend them. So we have to make sure the wheels engage first. Perfect. And then we can screw it down. You can see here why automatic movements are thicker than manual wind ones. The automatic bridge and the rotor gives you at least a couple extra millimeters in height. Some oil on the top of these jewels. And also here for these small pinions. The rotor goes in. Right in the middle, it has a wheel built in underneath. So we press down gently to make the teeth engage with the big pinion on the automatic bridge. And then we just fix it with a small clamp. That clamp goes in between the oscillating weight and the inbuilt wheel. Perfect. The only missing piece of the puzzle is the dial, which I would leave untouched 99% of the times. Wow, this is still very dirty underneath. The upper part seems okay-ish. The tritium plots aged to a very nice orange color, but the melted rubber managed to squeeze in and stain the borders of the dial. We will repeat the same process using regular Q-tips for the back of the dial and these special ones to see if we can clean a bit the dial itself. Before, we submerged the case back overnight, so we softened up a lot of that rubber and it was easier to remove. This one here feels quite stuck and it's gonna be a bit harder to take off. But in any case, I don't want to leave that underneath, so we'll try to clean it as much as possible. Okay. This is the furthest I can get. There's still some leftovers that I can't remove, but I'd say it's not concerning and we can leave it as it is. What is concerning though is this side. Dials are made layer by layer. You have a metal base and then you have coatings, paints and lacquer layers. The plan is to do the same here, but using a more precise Q-tip, also soaked in isopropanol, unfortunately, because water will not take any of the rubber away. And I say unfortunately because the problem is that isopropanol will also dissolve the upper lacquer layer and the minute marker paint if we're not careful. Trying to not smear it all over the place. This dial in particular is not a great candidate for cleaning because it has a silver finish with a frosted texture, so the rubber goes quite deep into it. And this is the end result here. Not perfect, you can still see some darker coloration around the dial, but if I keep going I risk dissolving some of this lacquer and paint and coating layers, so I'd rather leave it as it is, and I'm hoping it's not very noticeable through the crystal. Now, these here are the two case parts and the movement ring. Let's see if it's easier to assemble them now after the cleaning, but let me show you something first. This is an Omega encyclopedia called A Journey Through Time, and I found a little corner dedicated to the Seamaster compressor. We can see our dial variant on the right, and also a very important piece of information. There is a sketch of the case parts and mechanism. So we have only 4 parts: the upper case, the glass, the gasket, and the case back. And in the second paragraph it says water tightness is ensured by a gasket of special material compressed in between the back cover and the glass. So we still need a gasket to close the whole thing properly, and I bought every gasket in existence with similar measurements. But the problem is that I don't really know which shape do we need, and there are 0 pictures online. So looking at the back of the dial and judging by these leftovers, the inside of the gasket was round, and if I'm not mistaken, with the exact same measures as the movement ring. If we put this back in place, if you remember, we had rubber leftovers from the outside of the case to that inner side of the movement ring, which means I can't use any of these gaskets, and the only solution I can think of is making our own. What you're looking at is a 0.5mm nitrile rubber sheet, which is the thinnest I could find, and this is attached with double tape to a cutting mat. I read a post on a watch forum from someone with the same issue, so let's see if we're able to do this. The first step is to measure the inner diameter of the movement ring at 17.4. We now use a compass cutter and we set it at half of the distance we measured. One of the sides on this thing is a needle point, like in a regular compass, but on the other one we have a very sharp blade. So we use the spike as pivot point, and making sure we are sinking the blade in the nitrile rubber, we turn. There you go. Okay, I made 2 circles and they look pretty decent, so now my plan is to place the case back centered on top and with a regular cutter go over the edge so that we have the same cushion shape that the case has, but on the outside of the gasket. Okay, I need to go as close as I can to the case so that we don't have to cut anything afterwards. Let's have a look. And that looks pretty good. I think that's the shape we need, but I will make a couple more attempts just in case. This was way harder than I thought, but these are my best gaskets, and I think this one on the right is the winner. Let me show you how I think it's supposed to go. So movement ring in and then this on top. There you go. Not sure if it's gonna work, but there's only one way to find out. These Omega crystals with a weird shape are not pressed in, they are glued to the case. And to do that we use this GS Hypo Cement. This is a special glue that's pretty easy to remove if it's needed, so it's used to fix the crystals in place. It also comes with this thin applicator on top, which makes things a bit easier. We go over the edge where the crystal sits, and then we just put it in place and press for a few seconds. Beautiful. The case is looking great and this is starting to take shape. Now it's time to fit everything together. I have to say, it's a really cool case. I was a bit surprised to see the little success that this model had, considering it looks very similar to the Tag Heuer Monaco if you would add a chronograph complication in here, and the Monaco is still, to this day, one of Tag Heuer's most iconic watches, also introduced in 1969. Okay, and the gasket goes on top. Now, we place the dial on top, and in this case the dial screws are set at a depth that allow for the dial feet to remain fixed. Before fitting the hands, we have to put the rest of the stem and crown in because we want to change the time so the calendar turns exactly at midnight. Okay, good. So, as I was saying before, I did a bit of research to try to find out why this watch did not get any attention, and it turns out the exact same year that Omega introduced the watch to the market as the first square Omega Seamaster, other watch manufacturers released some of the most influential watches ever made, and that is no less than the introduction of the first automatic chronograph by Zenith, that's the one called El Primero, and more important, the first quartz wristwatch by Seiko. That's the Seiko Quartz Astron, which is an innovation that changed the watch industry forever, and it started the race between manufacturers, including Omega, to explore and adopt quartz movements. So I think this model, including the case concept, was not only overlooked by the public, but was most likely set aside by Omega to allocate their resources towards developing in-house quartz movements. Back to our Omega tool to close the case. Now we place it upside down, and theoretically we only need to press down. There you go. It's always a bit disturbing to hear such a loud noise, but that was much easier this time. And let's have a look. Absolutely amazing. The dial looks pretty good. At least we don't have any of the black rubber coming through. The case looks well closed and clean. There's a bit of wear on the spring bars, but we'll keep the original ones. And let me check. The hands work as they should. Great. Very unique watch. I love how it looks, but you know it's not over until we place some nice straps on it. And I thought dark blue ones would match perfectly. Let's see if these thick spring bars go through. Okay, perfect. The verdigris ate a bit of the plating on this, but still work as they should, and they seem to be custom made for this watch to resist the pressure when opening and closing the case without bending. It's really a shame that Omega didn't push this reference a bit more despite the circumstances. I think it's a beautiful one, has a lot of character, and it's quite different from what you see nowadays, which is a very common theme with Omegas from the 60s and 70s. That's why, in my opinion, vintage watches are much more interesting, and this one here is now back in shape after a few decades. Very pleased with the result. Thank you very much for joining me on the restoration journey. This was a challenging one for me, but I hope you enjoyed it. I will link some interesting resources for you on the video description, together with some books and also some of the equipment and tools I'm using, in case you're interested, so don't forget to check that out. Thanks again for watching, and see you on the next one.